conservationist movement. It wasn't even that, really. It was more companions on the trail. The Sierra Club was more of a hiking club. Brower was trying to change it.
There's a lot to be said for Dave Brower as a catalyst for so many things.
He had a plate full of dams and forests being cut down and wilderness places being overrun, and he wanted to fight all those battles.
I don't recall any kind of phraseology, terminology that we applied to ourselves. We were just this bunch of people who were battling PG&E because we didn't think there should be a nuclear plant on the San Andreas Fault.
And we had a meeting of the then what were considered conservationists. The word environmentalist didn't exist. I think it was David Brower said there probably should be a new organization. So we figured we were the somebodies.
From arguably Teddy Roosevelt through the Wilderness Act 1964, the environmental movement in this country was conservative, very much so. David Brower in 1960 voted for Nixon.
It was literally conserving. It was conservation. The two keywords of environmentalist and ecologist are latecomers compared to conservation.
The ecological context was definitely present in that movement already then.
We developed a pretty fine-tuned consciousness about where we were in the late 60s. You can't take acid and not realize that you're part of the place where you are.
People like Alan Watts and so on were throwing out ideas that made us all think that it's not just about how you think, but it's how your thinking and sensibility relates to the natural world. In the context, for example, of the war at the time, there were lots of things that were wrong in the world, and one of the things that it turned out was wrong was our relationship to nature. And
all sorts of just messed up stories from people about what was going on in Vietnam, and it was an easy jump from there with the Passaic River burning and the smog issues and things that you were learning about nuclear weapons, to start to think that, well, there are these bigger pictures.
We were into living in a more harmonious way with the planet right from the mid-60s. I mean, there was natural medicine, there was natural childbirth, there was organic foods, and there was sustainable living, essentially.
The poet named Alan Van Newkirk had been using the word bioregion. He described a way of seeing natural areas on the planet that had been developed by Raymond F. Dassman. He had written The Destruction of California, based on his experience in World War II, where he had seen big machines, DCATs, used to make airfields, and then brought back to the US and used to knock down forests. And Ray was a bona fide world-class ecologist. He had worked for the World Wildlife Fund and had developed a series of maps called Biotic Provinces of the World. And I just wrote directly to Ray and said, I like your ideas a lot. Why don't we put people in it and make a movement out of it that would be socio-political? And Ray wrote back and said, that's exactly what needs to be done.
There was a lot of Native American input into the hippie era, and that was very land-based. The Native Americans are the people that lived the longest in this North America, and we felt we had a lot to learn from the way they lived here.
if you think of 1972, this is when, some of the major legislation happened in the Nixon administration: Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, National Environmental Policy Act. And there wasn't this sense that the environment was a lefty issue as much. So many groups started right at that point of the late 60s. Friends of the Earth, Natural Resources Defense Council, Environmental Defense. So much happened right around that interesting point.
I think the environment movement as an interesting, engaging thing ended with the founding of Earth Day and the EPA. So since 1972, if you've been an honest person in regard to your identity within the biosphere, you really wouldn't want to be involved with those ends. That there was a whole other area, huge area, of redefinition to harmonize with natural systems rather than to protect or defend or whatever.
The folks who founded Greenpeace understood the interconnection between the environment, war and peace, and the media, and presenting an image. And that was fascinating stuff at the time.
People who were there back in the early days were very grounded in a social justice perspective. It wasn't just working on the environment. The founders really were civil rights activists and had a very deep belief in the environment as a civil right, and did serious science to evaluate who was getting the brunt of the pollution.
The things that are impacting our work right now is everything from the Black Panthers and civil rights movements in the 50s and 60s to the free speech movement and really early conservation groups. Like, all that stuff kind of comes together.
The biggest change from environmentalist politics to ecological politics for me is the difference between protest and proactive approaches. And it's finally coming on, which is to readapt human activities to the realities of natural systems and bioregions.
In the mid-70s, Richard Register and the others at Urban Ecology had begun to articulate their version of nature in the cities. I think there's a great deal of attention now to the quality of green space inside of cities, and I think that's only going to increase.
I never really followed any of the mainstream environmental organizations. I think because most of my political outlook is couched in the terms of local grassroots, person-to-person activism.
I love to go backpacking, and I love to hang out in the wilderness, and I love hanging out here in the garden 3 days a week. And I have this sort of like innate biophilia that I think drives a lot of environmental activists. But emotionally and intellectually, I do ecological activism as a social justice campaign, as a social justice crusade.
I wasn't interested in conservation just for conservation's sake, and much more interested in the way that the systems that we're operating in, that are in place currently today, ensure that some people bear more of a burden for environmental problems than others.
Organizationally, we're pushing ourselves and pushing our allies of, look, you have to move beyond just saying, oh, we want equity, or we want justice. Helpful, but not enough. And that if we can't really articulate what does that actually mean and how do you realize it, then I don't feel like we're in a position to be able to say to the MTCs or other decision makers, city council, the mayor, we want you to fix XYZ problem if we don't know what the solutions are.
I've long been cognizant that, for the environmental movement to succeed, or for any movement to succeed, you need a broad range of screamers, shouters, compromisers, lawyers, organizers, writers, etc. You need all hands on deck.
There's a certain ecology to the environmental movement where we have certain niches to occupy. I think we can all be better at working on a more common strategy, but I also think sometimes there is a role for groups to just be way out ahead.
This is worthwhile. I remember hearing Malcolm Margolin talking one time. He said that when Europeans started invading North America, that the most densely populated part of North America was the San Francisco Bay Area, all the way up into the Delta. Living was really easy. You could walk out and get shellfish and finfish and crabs and shoot deer and grind up acorns and all that stuff. Weather is mild. I mean, it doesn't get too hot or too cold. Rain's just about right. I also read one time that there were, I believe, something like 90 separate languages spoken by native peoples in California. And often people who lived on one side of a hill couldn't talk to the people who lived on the other side of the hill because they didn't need to move very far. And how that causes intellectual, environmental ferment, I don't know, but I think there may be some relation between those historical facts.
The Bay Area's got to be the most blessed place in the country, if not on the whole northern hemisphere, in the amount of open space. When I wrote my book on the geology of the San Francisco Bay region, I was struck again, just forcefully, at how much open space, how much nature, how much opportunity we have. You can walk a few miles in any direction and hit water, or hit a mountain, or a park or a forest.
The Bay Area has, I think, unique in California, this sense of place. People come here, moved here. I mean, historically, of course, a lot of people moved here for the gold rush or to work in various industries. But once they were here, I think they kind of looked around and they said, "Boy, this is really nice. This is a nice place." And land conservation started here a long time ago in the depths of the Depression. Regional park districts were formed, and they and some of the water agencies started buying up watershed land.
I came from a mountain inland state. We didn't have a big, beautiful body of water like this, and I was just struck with its beauty, and so was Kay Kerr and Esther Gillick. We could all look out and see the bay from our homes. We're appalled at this idea of filling it in, because it could have been made to be just sort of like a river. Already 1/3 had been filled in. Berkeley at that time had a plan to fill in almost 2,000 acres. And so our first goal was to defeat the plan that the city of Berkeley had.
The bridge was being built, and they said, Marin County is going to be inundated, and we don't want to be like Los Angeles. So we have to do something. So they started the Marin Garden Club, and they raised enough money to hire the first county planner in the state. Big stuff. So Marin got a general plan.
When I was organizing U.S. Wind Power in 1978, my original thing, and when I was still working on the Senate Energy Committee, trying to get legislative support, I went to people like Boeing, who were the leaders in making windmills under government support. They thought it was a joke. Say, "Hey Joe, come on here, you gotta hear this. This guy thinks they're gonna make thousands of windmills. They're gonna make thousands of windmills and put them side by side on ridges. And the wind's gonna blow and they're gonna make all this power. It's really great, you gotta hear this." You know, it was a big joke, you know. We built 4,000 windmills in Altamont. You know, in 1978, nobody had ever seen 2 windmills side by side generating electricity anywhere in the world.
You know, once you get rid of gold mining as a source, and pollution gets ratcheted back from the delta, from the farming community because of changes in the pesticide programs and herbicides and whatnot, and the natural contractions by the market of the industrial activities, what you were left with was the bay was run by military bases, of which 4 were on the Superfund list. You know, we're talking about, you know, well over 27,000 acres of land.
I'm struck, as we talked about it, how much things have changed in 50 years. The whole way that our government works, that our citizens are involved, has changed incredibly. And it happened, interestingly enough, in many different areas parallel.
I just want to say what a rich environment in terms of people there has been in the Bay Area, and the passion that people have had to really think through these issues and put their life into making things better. And I think that that creates difficulty too, because there's a lot of friction in the environmental movement. People fight because they're so passionate about it. But I think that that's been, for me, the most wonderful thing is just seeing how people, regular people in their neighborhoods, learn so much. They'll learn all kinds of science, they'll learn all kinds of law because they have to protect their kids. People in the organizations at CBE, just wonderful people who work so hard to make things better, and that gives me hope, even when I'm really pessimistic about where we are, that It's the people that are going to do it.
City is an urban overlay on natural systems. The facilities of a city and the activities, water, energy, food, etc., should be geared toward the natural systems that the urban area has been overlaid upon. This will be done. It will be done from necessity. Right now it sounds a little fairy tale-ish that urban areas are in nature, but in fact, no development of the city in the future will be able to be done without accounting for these natural systems.
There's got to be a balance where you look at using the city to actually create the things that people need to survive, as well as using it to create a more flourishing democracy, like people actually being involved in decision making and things that relate to what they need, and then a connection between urban places to rural environments that do support us.
I really strongly believe on the value of local agriculture and the culture of local agriculture. And I don't care whether it's organic or commercial. It's really important for people to be connected to their food.
It's very encouraging to see the food systems work that's come up. That's organic is so important, but it was never ever just organic that was going to solve, the bigger picture. So that kind of food justice struggles that are there, alternative distribution systems, an entire market and economy that's grown up around providing alternatives.
Cities are never going to be food self-sufficient, right? We don't have enough land and space here to grow wheat for ourselves, much less pasture-raised goats. But what happens, again, by growing some of our food, not only do we cultivate that ecological consciousness by getting people more aware of their surroundings and our reliance on natural systems, but then we start to take the pressure off of the countryside. Like, imagine if San Francisco produced 30% of its own fruits and vegetables. That then opens up space for the spinach growers and the strawberry growers to not just grow spinach and strawberries. If cities become more self-sufficient, and that doesn't mean 100% self-sufficient, but as cities become more self-sufficient, it just lessens the slack.
We need to develop a suburban backyard farm movement, which is to say to take all of the lawns that surround cities, because you have a lot of roof gardens now growing food, but that can never begin to feed 2% of the people, But there's a gigantic amount of basically unused land that is just growing grass, growing water-consumptive grass.
We really need to attack the whole fossil fuel problem. The way we structure our energy use is inherently problematic and is becoming catastrophic.
The problem with cities, it seems to me, is primarily the problem of cars. I mean, if you're in Copenhagen or Rome and you see what a pedestrian area can do in terms of the quality of life in the city, you realize that this thing is really absurd. So the city just has to deal with the car problem as the number one issue. If you've ever been in Manhattan when there's been a taxi strike, it can be marvelous because there's so many, there's so few private cars and so many cabs, Just a taxi strike and the city becomes magical.
So there's a growing interest in what's called low-impact development, which says when you build something, you should try to, as much as possible, mimic the way water would naturally behave. It has tremendous benefits for clean water. It also happens to be more aesthetic. The more plants you use, the more you're sequestering carbon, which is something that we need to be doing, and it would have the effect of making our cities more generally permeable to wildlife. And in California, where we have water shortage issues, it's also how you recharge the groundwater.
And my idea of restoring a creek is doing as little as necessary to make it become natural, and just let it happen.
Picked up a copy of the Potrero View one day and saw on the front a picture of an egret flying over a freeway. And I didn't even know that the bird was called an egret, but I knew that it was something really neat that I sort of thought as being something that you went somewhere else to see. And to find out that it was in San Francisco really grabbed my imagination and my attention.
Whenever you see in the paper that somebody saw a coyote in San Francisco, I jump up and yell, "Yay!"
It's fascinating right now to see the coyotes coming back into the urban environment, seeing these megafauna, these different kinds of critters just popping back up. It's a wonderful thing because urban environments tend to bleach those things out because they're scary, they don't fit. And we're trying to figure out a better way to fit, and I think that's very exciting work.
This is some people's favorite question.
Okay.
Can there be ecological sanity in a world system based on growth? Or do you think growth can be redefined and replaced with something else? And can capitalism persist under another paradigm?
The answer to the initial question is obviously no. We can't find ecological sustainability based on growth. It's just illogical. The majority of the world is not benefiting from our system of growth.
The system that we now have, which is global economics, global capitalism, global market economy, so on, I think that's just a really failed, obsolete, absurd system, and the absurdity of it is really well revealed now by the limitations of the planet, by climate change, by global resource depletion, water, forests, arable soil, fish in the seas, key minerals and so on. That's all, the basis of industrial society and economic growth is over.
I do not think that the current system is sustainable in any way, shape, or form.
I just know that what's happening is wrong, and that we obviously can't keep on growing. It's just sort of intuitive, you can't do that.
I think you have to redefine it. I think you can have economic health without growth. You have new products, you have different way of delivering them. I mean, look at, well, we can get into a whole, we go on for hours, man.
We need to have our work be integrated with the actual physical reality of the earth that we live on and the limited resources.
Economic growth in a limited system simply does not work, So everybody goes and buys a Prius. Come on, what? What are you going to do? That's going to solve the problem.
I don't think that there can be ecological sanity in a system based on growth. There are ways to move forward that aren't growth. There are ways to progress that are not growth.
It's Abby who said that growth for its own sake is the logic of the cancer cell, and that's just so apparent to me, right? There's nothing in nature that grows forever.
We need to find a steady state economy. The population is so big that if we were going to grow, I don't know where we could get the resources to grow. I think, a friend, growth is a really horrible term. I think it's a misconception. It represents a misconception of what's enjoyable for the human species.
Clearly, economic growth is the model of our society, and it's completely antithetical to ecological sustainability. Sustainability is, a steady state, or even possibly regenerating the systems that exist and making them more productive over the long term.
I actually think growth is the number one wisdom we take from natural systems, is this idea of recycling, is this idea of death and renewal.
The economy, I think, is over the long haul going to, as we understand it now, is going to continue to contract. More people are going to continue to lose their jobs. And what we think of as jobs and livelihood is going to go through a transition, and we better start getting our heads around it quickly because people are hurting.
The economy that's going to be valid is kind of a participatory, local, small-scale or regional economy where it's not about wages, it's really about participation in all economic processes.
Livelihood in the future may look like a combination of part-time, small-scale urban farmer in your backyard, plus some barter work and some exchange work and maybe some part-time work driving a bus. It might be a much more creative patchwork thing.
Part of that idea of living within our own means and challenging the idea of growth is realizing that there's not that many techno fixes. We're not in a technological predicament, we're in a social, cultural, political predicament.
There are so many areas that are still unexplored for living together on the planet. There's so many programs and policies that are possible. It's really a new world that way.